Looks like we're on. All right.
Yay, we figured it out.
Yay. Technology. Awesome. All right. Well, thanks everyone for bearing with me on this first YouTube live stream that I'm doing. I haven't done it before. And welcome to A Day in the Life. Today I have Christine Cassidy Itta on with me. She is a museum educator, if I can speak. And we met both at the college we went to, which is Presbyterian College, during band class, I believe, anyway. I was a freshman and she was a junior, and I felt really special when she invited me to dinner with her and another upperclassman. And just pretty quickly over time, we became super close through band and our sorority and other things. And she ended up adopting me as her little sister in the sorority. When Christine graduated, she became a teacher, but not too long after that, she up and decided to move to rural Alaska, where she met her husband, Tony. And now they live in Anchorage, Alaska, where Christine works at the Anchorage Museum and recently got her master's in museum education. She also recently bought her first house and lives there happily with her husband, Tony, and her corgi, Winston. Welcome, Christine.
Hi, everyone. Just to start us off, I'm going to go ahead and do land acknowledgement. So I'm coming to you from the homelands, traditional homelands of the Kootenai Dena'ina. They have made this area their home and have been stewarding the land, plants, animals, and waters for thousands of years in the past and on into the present and the future. And if you're not aware of whose indigenous lands you're living on, all of us here in North America are living on somebody's traditional homelands. But Rachel's going to put in the show notes a link to Native Land where you can start investigating whose land you live on.
Yeah, thanks, Christine. And thanks for teaching me about this. I did not know about this website. And I, in turn, want to thank and acknowledge that I'm on the lands of the Yokuts Nation. And I am grateful for them for stewarding this land, their ancestors and their descendants for their constant and careful stewardship of this land. And yeah, maybe actually my first question, Christine, is could you maybe educate me and the audience a little bit more on what land acknowledgements are and what they're for and why we do them?
Yeah, so land acknowledgements are a little bit newer practice here in the US. They kind of have started in Canada and Australia and some other places that have been colonized sooner, but they're now making their way to the US, and they're a great way to kind of ground yourself and your presentation and acknowledge indigenous histories and indigenous peoples, and that the lands that we live on here in North America did not just come into being and were empty when settlers came to live here, but that they have always been here and there have always been people living on them. So it's just a great opportunity to kind of help your audience kind of boost their curiosity about whose lands they might be living on or visiting as well.
Yeah, thanks for sharing, Christine. So changing gears a little bit, let's just talk about what you do at the museum.
Yeah, well, let's see, gosh, I'm a museum educator, so I wear a lot of different hats. But we do land acknowledgements before all of the programs and the field trips and those kinds of things that we do. So that's actually is part of my job. And I do some professional development around land acknowledgement and cultural appropriation and different ways of teaching with teachers and here locally. I guess my everyday thing during the school year, we do a lot of school group field trips to the museum. So taking them around different galleries and using inquiry-based methods of looking at different objects in our collection and learning more about the artworks and the objects and the cultures. We're a museum of art, history, science, and culture. So we have a lot of topics that we cover. So each kind of school group looks a little bit different, and we try and let the students guide it as much as possible. I'm also in charge of Blink, which is our 5 and under programming at the museum. So for my master's thesis, I rewrote our entire early childhood program curriculum for that program. And that's a big part of what I do. And then the other kind of major part on the floor where I'm interacting with visitors is I facilitate and choose lots of the activities and develop lots of the activities in CoLab, which is our hands-on making and invention space. Kind of like a makerspace light. We don't have as many of the technologies as some other makerspaces do, but it's the same kind of feel. We do things like embroidery and bookbinding and all kinds of different things like that. So you're learning new skills and getting to try them out in that space. And then also on the other end of things, I do curriculum development projects, both for internal use on our resource hub that's a free resource for the public, but then also sometimes partnering with other outside organizations or the Anchorage School District on developing specific curriculum needs for those entities. So lots of things. No day is ever the same.
Yeah, it doesn't sound like it. You do a lot of things. And I didn't think about the fact that, yeah, your museum does like all the things. There are like, I remember when I was in Anchorage, there were a few places that honored like the Native Alaskans, but what, like, are there other museums in Alaska besides yours, really?
Yeah,
I
we
mean,
have a
Anchorage,
lot of, yeah, we have
not
a
a
lot
lot.
small museums in Alaska, and there's a couple small ones in Anchorage. There's well, the Alaska Native Heritage Center, which isn't quite a museum, but is a cultural organization, and is a great place to visit to learn more about Alaska Native cultures. And they're pretty large. But then we have in Anchorage, there is the Aviation Museum, and then there's also another smaller science museum here in Anchorage. And across Alaska, we have a really high number of museums, but they're mostly smaller museums. We're the largest one in the state. And so a lot of the other museums are really small, like a couple of people running everything. So they wear even more hats than I do.
I bet. And what got you interested in museum education?
I liked the idea of doing all of the positives of education that I loved, working with people, trying out new activities, and kind of just investigating different ways of learning without some of the things that I didn't like quite as much, like behavior management and grades. I hated grading papers and kind of inputting grades and that kind of thing. So it's all the like things that I loved to do without any of the negatives.
Nice. Yeah, I can definitely see that. Like I guess when you have those student classes come in, it's the teachers mostly responsible for kind of that management, not you.
Yeah, they
Yeah.
do most of the management. We do a little bit, but it's nowhere near like when I was a classroom teacher.
Mm-hmm. And I feel like you kind of touched on this already, but what do you like the most about your job?
I like that there's something new to do every day. And also that like our interests are really what guides the path that the education department is taking. Um, like I was really interested in culturally relevant curriculum development. And so that's what I get to work on outside of my other job duties. So that's like really nice to have that level of flexibility and just kind of like ownership over what you're working on.
Totally. Yeah. What would you say is your least favorite part of your job?
Mm, Oh gosh. Museums are interesting places. So they're really colonized and they have that kind of history of colonization. So sometimes there's a lot of red tape and hoops to jump through. Not always. We try and minimize it as much as possible, but you do have to do some of the stuff that's like not your favorite because it's just an aspect of your job that you have to do. Like cleaning exhibits after we're closed and kind of all of those like management type things, which are less fun than the like hanging out with people all day and learning about science and culture and how to sew kind of stuff.
Yeah. What do you mean? Could you like explain a little bit more what you mean about like museums having a history of colonization?
Yeah. So all museums are from a Western perspective. There are a lot of museums that are now starting to include more Indigenous perspectives and other perspectives as well, like traditional ecological knowledge in science museums being worked into kind of the Western approach to science is happening more often. But especially in like cultural and anthropological museums, and especially the ones that are dealing with Indigenous cultures, a lot of those museums gained the objects that they're housing and caretaking in unethical ways. So that's a huge issue in museums right now, trying to figure out, should we repatriate things? Should we continue caretaking? How can we better include Indigenous voices in the development of exhibitions and curriculum that we're working on for education and programs and that kind of thing? And how can we, kind of right these hundreds of years of this colonial institution existing and the like hierarchy and bureaucracy that is involved in those kinds of things, and make it so it's more friendly and that more people are feeling welcomed in the museums and like it's a place for them, and also that they're have ownership in the museum itself and their objects that are housed in these places.
Yeah, that's a lot to think about for sure, but definitely worth thinking about and really important. And I know you're super passionate about creating curriculum that's culturally competent. So what kind of considerations or what does that involve from your side?
I try and stay in touch with a lot of the conversations that are happening nationally, especially in Alaska, but then also throughout the United States. So attending a lot of professional development, because I think it's really on me to make sure that I'm up to date on those kinds of things. That's my responsibility as an educator and as an ally. And then the biggest thing is like doing your research and making sure your research comes from really reliable sources, and is stuff that should be shared widely. Because sometimes if you're looking at particularly older anthropology type texts, some of the stuff that they're sharing is inaccurate because it comes from an outsider perspective. And sometimes it's stuff that they witnessed that's sacred and really should not be shared with just, whoever your general population audience. So that's really important to think about as you're looking into what should I teach about, what objects should I teach about, what parts of culture should I be sharing. And then one of my biggest things is always uplifting voices from the source culture. So recently I helped create a cultural arts curriculum for Anchorage School District that they're going to be starting to use in middle school art classes. And all of the resources that I used there are videos from Indigenous people, Indigenous speakers, so that those are the voices that students are hearing and not my voice. Because I'm not the expert. I'm kind of like a vehicle for helping put what resources are out there into an easily usable curriculum for teachers, because sometimes it is overwhelming, the number of things that are out there and you just don't know where to look. So trying to kind of compile that down is helpful. And then I guess the last point I usually try and make is that has to be a living curriculum, because we're always learning more about how Indigenous peoples want to share about their cultures and how culturally competent curriculum in schools and those practices are like rapidly evolving. So I do a lot of writing and then reviewing, and we always send our lesson plans and our curriculum out to one of our curators reviews them internally at the museum, but then we also have elders and culture bearers outside of the museum reviewing them before they get sent out to the school district. So making sure that we really have the best understanding and are sharing the right resources and that kind of thing. And then it sometimes involves teaching and adjusting those, because sometimes as you're developing their curriculum, you think it's going to go one way, and then when you actually teach it in the classroom, it can turn out very differently. So that's a big part of it too. It's kind of letting it be a living curriculum, so you're not afraid to continue changing it down the line.
Yeah, I can totally see that. Because I mean, nothing in life is static. And then yeah, it's a really interesting point about like once you bring it in front of people and people react completely differently, or it comes off a different way. Like communication is just so difficult. Um, that is very, very fascinating. Thanks for sharing.
Mhm.
Um, just kind of my kind of last question around work, and then we'll talk a little bit more about like life in Alaska. But how has your life, like kind of your day in the life at work, changed since the pandemic kind of happened?
Yeah, that made a really big impact on museum education, particularly when layoffs first started happening with COVID. The people who were laid off in museums were front of house staff, visitor service type things, party rentals, and education. Those were like the biggest departments that had layoffs. We were really lucky that we didn't lose anyone from our department. A couple of people had reduced hours throughout last summer, but we're all back to full time now. So that's a huge thing with museum education in general across the US. Right now, you're seeing lots and lots and lots of museum education jobs be posted and advertised because some institutions are just now being able to hire back their educators. Um, so there's a lot of issues there with museum education is the newest part of museum culture. And so we often aren't recognized as being as valuable as like curatorial and some of those other things. So it's gaining like what's the right word? Just like awareness and value that other people are really starting to value museum education, but it's still like not fully there at the same level. So then just for me personally, my work shifted because before the pandemic, I was on the floor probably between 75% and 80% of the time I was there, doing field trips, facilitating in collab, doing Blink programming for the 5 and under, and all of those kinds of things that have to happen, there at the museum, interacting with people. Like the education department and the front of house are the face of the museum. When people think of who works there, they think of the ones that they're interacting with, and that's us. So when everything shut down, obviously I'm not facilitating on the floor. There were no more school groups suddenly. It was actually ASD's spring break, Anchorage School District spring break, when that all happened. So we went from having, some of the largest numbers per day we have in a year because it's a holiday vacation, to we shut down that Friday of that week. And I work Tuesday through Saturday normally. So we shut down like my Thursday. I still had another day and we were done. Went home. It suddenly was like going home, and we're not coming back for, I think at first it was 2 weeks, and then it just kept growing and growing, like for everybody. So then I was full-time, pivoting to full-time curriculum development. So we created a lot of resources for our resource hub that's free educational resources. For some of them are designed with classrooms in mind, and some of them are designed like home use in mind. But either one of them could go, for either environment, if you're formally working in a classroom or informally at home and just looking for something fun to do. So working a lot on those. We did a lot of making guides for collab on the activities that we like to do in there. So there's one that like takes you step by step into embroidery. Paper flowers is another one I made, weaving, some of the things that we do in there. Also, I released, for more than a year, I released a new Blink at Home that was adapting what we do in our normal program at the museum into home use for the 5 and under crowd. So I released one of those a week for more than a year, that was a lot doing that. But it was really exciting because that was the only way we could connect with our members and our usual audience and that thing. So we got to stay connected. And they sometimes would email me requests for different topics that they would like to see in those Blink activities and things. So that was really cool to have like that kind of co-development with visitors and what they were looking for. And then now I am, let's see, I'm on the floor Fridays and Saturdays now. We're waiting to see, it might change a little bit with some of the numbers and stuff this fall. We're not really sure what's going to happen exactly. Some of the programs are a big question mark for the fall. But I am in collab on Friday, Saturday. We're only open 4 days a week. So I'm now, like, the museum's open 6 days a week, but collab is only open 4 of those days right now. So I do 2 days in there, and my coworker Madi does 2 days in there a week. And then the rest of my time has been working on finishing up curriculum for Anchorage School District. And then I also have a couple of professional developments with Anchorage School District coming up here at the beginning of August. And then prepping for some other events that I'm helping support here, early learner events. So it's really changed a lot. And I don't really know what it's going to look like. I don't know. I still don't know what like the normal is going to be after this. So, because we can't do full-time, like I was working a full-time on the floor position, and then suddenly I was working a full-time off the floor position, and I can't do 2 positions at once. So some things are going to have to go, and I don't know what those like things are going to be yet. So I don't know. It's kind of exciting. And the curriculum development is like really what I'm passionate about. So I really loved the chance to kind of hone some of those skills and grow them over the past year and a half.
Yeah, it sounds like you've had some really exciting opportunities through all of this, even though it has been a big, huge adjustment and change in for everyone. And it's definitely like, yeah, a big question mark about what the future is. But it sounds like you've been able to make some good opportunities for yourself through that. So that's exciting. Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about Alaska in general. What was the biggest culture shock for you when you moved there?
Oh gosh, probably just moving to rural Alaska. Like, you say rural Alaska before you go to rural Alaska, and you're like, okay, well, I've lived in kind of rural areas before. Like, our college wasn't in an urban setting, it was like a rural town, smaller town and everything. No, this is rural. Like,
Yeah, you could drive to our college at least from anywhere
yeah.
in the state.
So that was the biggest thing. Yeah. So I was teaching in Atkasuk, which is, all the way north. It's about 60 miles south of Utqiagvik, which is the furthest town north in the US. And you had to fly in on one of those little like 8-seater planes to be able to get there. They have a little store, but it's not like nearly as close to stocked as like even the smaller grocery stores that I've ever shopped in. Like no fresh fruit or vegetables. In the summer, it's fly-in only. In the winter, if you have a snow machine, you can drive from Utqiagvik to Atkasuk, but I haven't done it because I am not up to that level of cold for that long. That's not my favorite.
Sounds intense.
Yeah. And then I remember the first summer my parents came up, they wanted to see Atkasuk. So the first summer after my first year of teaching, they flew up to Atkasuk for a couple of days. And then we were going to fly and do Fairbanks and Denali and some of those other things. And we almost got snowed in, and it was June. So, snow. After South Carolina, that was a shock.
That is a shock. Yeah. Yeah. And how has living in Alaska just informed your various life choices regarding your life and career?
Yeah, I'd say it's really shaped my career, especially also my life choices. I never had thought I would eat things like whale on a regular basis, and my husband's a Inupiaq, and so I eat all of the cultural foods that he likes to eat, and I like them too now. So that's kind of like the least way, but then kind of like professional and stuff. I was always passionate about curriculum development. But once it was like my students, my nieces and my nephews, my stepdaughter / sister-in-law, they are Indigenous students. And so in order for me to best like advocate for what they need in schools and, you know, my own future children, I needed to know more about Indigenous education. And the school district that I moved up here to work for, I chose to work for because of their curriculum development, that they were embedding the curriculum in the Inupiaq culture. So that's why I chose to move up here. That was a huge opportunity for a second year teacher. But I had to learn more. And so in learning more, I became even more passionate and like thrilled to learn more, you know, kind of that thirst for knowledge. So that's really shaped my career. I think when I graduated, if you'd told me I would be living here doing what I'm doing, I would maybe not have believed you, just because it's so different from where I was living in South Carolina and my like everyday then. But now it's such a central part of just who I am and what I do professionally, and also like in my spare time, that I don't know, I can't imagine it being any different.
Yeah, for sure. I feel like now I can't imagine you not living in Alaska, but yeah, I would have been shocked like years ago. like when you said you were going to Alaska, I was like, what? Alaska? You just don't think of people going to Alaska, which is a shame. Like after visiting you in Alaska a couple times now, I'm like, wow, it's such a beautiful state with so much like rich history, but it's you know, that state up in the north that people think is smaller than it actually is. Like I loved all those t-shirts in Alaska that are like comparing the size of Texas to Alaska. So funny. Um, so I know you've kind of taught me some lingo before, but what are some of those words that like Alaskans use that you have to learn? Like for like the one I remember is calling the continental US the lower 48.
Mm-hmm.
What else is there?
Yeah, so it's the lower 48. My husband also sometimes says downstates. I don't think I've adopted that into my vernacular quite yet, but that's another one. I think I used it before, but snow machine. We don't call snowmobiles, they're snow machines. And then there's a lot of them that are just like Inupiaq words or other indigenous words that I've picked up from other languages. So like ulu is a really common one, and those are the little knives that are kind of roundish, and you can use them for all kinds of things. Cutting fish is one of the big things, but we use ours in the kitchen all the time. My parents and I also both use it for cutting pizza sometimes because it makes it just like a really good pizza cutter. So, and then muktuk is whale. So that was one. And then the one that I can never remember the English for it. I always have to stop and think about it, is Kunichuk, which is like your Arctic entryway. So a lot of times instead of going directly into the house, you'll go into like an entryway so that the cold air isn't going like all the way into the house. Like it helps with heating and things. Yeah, so that's a Kunichuk, and I can't ever, Arctic entry, I never remember that.
Yeah, sounds to me like a decontamination chamber on like a spaceship or something.
It's kind of the same idea. You go in, you get your snow off, and like ditch all of your warm clothes before
It's
you go into
smart.
the house.
Yeah, yeah, that's a great idea and something always living in fairly warm places I've never had to experience or never have experienced, not like had to, but that's interesting. Yeah. So when would you say is the best time to visit Alaska and where should anyone looking to visit go?
That's such a hard question. It depends on what you want. So if you're like a summer person, summer is great because of all of the like hiking and fishing. You can go see Denali, which is the largest mountain, formerly known as Mount McKinley, but they officially changed the name to Denali, which is one of the indigenous names for the mountain. And then, gosh, there's all kinds of like rich museums and stuff. Like, definitely come to the Anchorage Museum. It's worth it. The Alaska Native Heritage Center is a great place for learning about more about Alaska Native cultures as well. And just like going to some of the smaller places if you have time for it is wonderful. I love the train personally. So you get to do the train in the summertime and the views are just gorgeous and you don't have to worry about driving yourself. You can just enjoy the scenery. So that's one I always say. But then winter time is also good if you don't mind the cold, because that's when you can see the northern lights. Um, so a lot of people want to, like, that's on their bucket list of things to do. But you can't see them really in the summer because it's light all the time. And the sun doesn't really go down. So you have to wait until it's like fall or winter or even into spring. Those colder times are better for seeing them, not only because that's when it gets dark, but the northern lights are just better those times of years as well, more active. Um, but then we also have like cross country skiing and downhill skiing and snow machining, and there's all kinds of cool ice sculpture competitions. So it just kind of depends on if you like the cold stuff or you want to do the warm weather kind of thing.
Yeah, I definitely get that. And yeah, I'm really hoping to do a trip sometime soon-ish, going in the fall or winter, because I want to see those northern lights. Like I really want to. Hopefully, like they're there when I'm there.
Mm-hmm.
Um, so we actually have a question from the chat from our good friend Caitlin. What advice would you have for someone moving somewhere very different from where you grew up for the first time?
Ooh, that's a great question, Caitlin. Also, hi. Um, I guess my advice is to not be afraid to like try new things. Try whatever the local foods are. Try finding those, like if you're in a large city or a larger town, try finding those like local favorite places and that kind of thing, and really just like um, immerse yourself in other cultures if you're someplace that has a different culture than where you grew up. And then also, a lot of times, I know this is like a super funny thing, but I remember when I moved up, I had to get all kinds of cold gear because I didn't have any before. And so asking people who live there what their favorite like brands are for different things and that kind of thing is great because they know what works best in their area. So that was a huge help to me. I remember discussing that with Caitlin when she and Micah moved to Buffalo, because Micah had never been living someplace super far north for like that long. And I was like, make sure he gets his cold stuff.
Yeah. Yeah, and I feel like definitely talking to the locals about that too, because it's so hard to tell online. Like we're all like, oh, there's so many resources available online, but then the locals are the ones who actually know how it actually is.
Yeah, I would have made very different, some of my clothing purchases, I would have made different choices initially if I had um, asked local people instead of just trying to do online.
Uh-huh. Yeah, because they know.
Mhm.
And yeah, do you think you would have stayed in Alaska if you hadn't met your husband, Tony?
That's a tough question. I really enjoy Alaska. And if I didn't have some of the health issues that I wanted to be better or closer to healthcare, health infrastructure, I probably would have stayed teaching in Otkasuk. But then we chose to move to Anchorage instead. So, gosh, I probably wouldn't have stayed, assuming, the same health issues. I wouldn't have been able to stay in Otkasuk. But I loved Alaska so much. I may have decided to stay here, but it's also really far from my friends and family. And there's like a 4-hour time difference between me and my parents. And I don't get to see them as often because it's expensive and just a long trip and that kind of thing. So I don't know.
Yeah, it's definitely tough. Like how you never know like what the other path of life would have
Mhm.
where it would have gone because you didn't make that choice or that other thing didn't happen. So yeah, definitely a hard question I threw at you. I'm kind of curious, like you said in Akasuk, the store is super small, like it didn't have much stuff. So what did the locals do to eat? Did they buy from the store? Or did they like I know that like Tony likes to go hunting when he goes up there. So
Mhm.
like what do they do?
Yeah, so there's buying from the store, which is mostly like frozen type things or shelf items. Um, Also, you can do like a bush order from the grocery stores. Well, they'll ship it out to you. So you can like order a lot of stuff at one time and save on the shipping out to you, and they'll fly it in. And then most families, I'd say pretty much all of the families in rural Alaska supplement with hunting and fishing and berry picking and kind of gathering from the land and plants and animals to supplement because it's just so expensive. in those stores. And even if you're having stuff shipped in, it's more expensive here than it is in the lower 48.
Yeah, that's interesting. Because I mean, you talk about like, yeah, so there's like that modern life, but then that's what they traditionally have done for like centuries. So like it's kind of mixing those two and trying to find a balance there.
Yeah.
Yeah. So another kind of cultural thing that's been really interesting to me, and you kind of mentioned this before when you mentioned your stepdaughter slash sister-in-law is like for a while, and sometimes like even when she still visits, you've been helping parent your husband Tony's younger sister who is adopted into the family, and as you've talked to me before, adoption is very different in Alaska. So could you just talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So Frances, um, Tony's parents adopted Frances when she was a baby. And then his mom passed when she was really little, and his dad passed a couple of years ago. So since then, Tony and his sister Lily have been kind of, well, and his other brothers have been sharing parenting responsibilities for Frances, because she was, gosh, 10 or 11 when dad passed away. But her adoption is also different than most of the models of adoption that I had seen in the lower 48. I had never known anyone that had an open adoption. So that was one thing that was different. Frances's adoption is very much an open adoption. And it's really common in a lot of indigenous cultures for extended family to help kind of raise children. So aunties and cousins and all kinds of things, might help raise a child. Sometimes it's official adoption, like in Frances's case, they officially adopted her and went through all the paperwork. And sometimes it's just that like the kid will go live with a relative for like a year or the summer or something like that. And that's also super common because that's just part of kinship in a lot of indigenous cultures, that you help, take care of your family and whatever your family needs for however long they need to. And so that extends to like childcare and raising the child and parenting as well. Um, so in Frances's case, like when she was here the other week for visiting and getting some appointments and stuff, she also got to go see her biological mom and her siblings who also live here in Anchorage. And she's in contact with them regularly. She talks to her family, her biological family, and then also her adopted family. And there is a lot of overlap there as well. So she's related to Tony biologically, but then also they adopted her. So yeah, it gets kind of complicated, and it was a learning curve for me coming from the lower 48 where closed adoptions are way more common, and I just hadn't experienced anything like it. But I think it's really great that she can stay connected to all of her family and just that like kinship of everything and what that means to be family. It's not the nuclear family of like mom, dad, kids. It's like all of your aunties and your cousins and your uncles, and some of them you might not technically be related to, but they helped raise you too. So they're family.
Yeah, I think that is so interesting and valuable because I mean, like you always hear that expression, it takes a village to raise a child. And it's only a good thing to have more positive role models in your life or different people to give to just shape you as a person. And just like in our modern society, typically or at least in the United States, I don't even know, like I think other countries are still like families all still live in the same city, but we just move and spread out so much. And yeah, I really love that's still being preserved in those cultures like that. It's really cool. Well, I mean, those are all the questions I had, Christine. Really thank you for coming on. And do you have any other like resources or anything you'd like to share? If not, you can just send them to me as well, and I'll put them in the description afterwards. But any places you recommend people going to learn more about anything we talked about today?
Yeah. Oh gosh. So one of my favorite resources for learning about Indigenous cultures in the classroom and teaching about Indigenous cultures in the classroom is National Museum of the American Indian, that's Smithsonian. And even if you aren't a teacher, some of their professional development stuff are just so interesting and great resources for learning more about Indigenous histories and policy in the US and all kinds of stuff. So definitely go check them out. Um, and I'll share some of my favorite resources for learning more about cultural appropriation too. Most of them are Alaska because I like to try and stay local when I'm working with local teachers, but I am giving a professional development on cultural appropriation and curriculum development next week. So I've got a couple of those great things picked out. There's a wonderful podcast called Coffee and Quack that's done by Alice Connick Glynn. And quack is like it's a frozen meat that you eat. It's a traditional Inupiaq food. I'm not sure. I always forget what it is exactly. So I'm sorry, I did not look that up again. But that's a really great podcast for just learning more about Indigenous experiences in Alaska. They did a great one with cultural appropriation that has Melissa Shaganoff in it, who used to work at the Anchorage Museum. And I was lucky enough to be able to partner with her on a couple of projects and things and just like have conversations with her. And then there was one more thing, but I think it slipped my mind. What was it? Oh, that's what it is. It's okay. So there's another podcast that I really like for learning more about Indigenous experiences in the US. And that is called All My Relations. And one of the hosts is like my favorite Indigenous scholar for learning more about cultural appropriation, just because I like the way she presents it. And her name's Dr. Adrienne Keene. She's Cherokee. And then also Matika is the other co-host. So there's two co-hosts, and then they bring in other people as well. And it's just a great podcast for listening, and really expands your knowledge about Indigenous perspectives and histories and experiences.
Yeah. Thanks for sharing, Christine. We actually have another question, if you don't mind hanging on for another minute. With mainstream Americans finally seeing the terrible things that have been done to Indigenous people, what is something we can do to help?
Oh, okay. What is something you can do to help? The biggest thing is like educating yourself as much as possible to start out with. So learn more about your area, learn more about the US in general, because there's just so much that we didn't learn in school, or we're just like barely taught in school. So kind of you taking that on yourself so that you can be a more effective ally is great. And then sharing with other people what you learn. Like sometimes I get bogged down because I can't change some of the like institutional things that are really ingrained in different places, school districts and those kinds of things. Like I don't have the clout to be able to go change those things myself. But just kind of spreading what I've learned and sharing my experiences and my resources with other people is kind of creating a ripple effect. So I've been working in Anchorage School District, kind of doing some of this work for a while now, and helping support the work before I was directly the one that was doing it. And it's just like huge how many teachers we've now helped change perspectives and build resources in their knowledge, and they've changed classroom perspectives and are sharing with other teachers what they're doing. And mostly it's not because they didn't want to or they didn't think it was important. It was just that they didn't know how. So always looking for different ways where you can learn more about how to help from Indigenous peoples especially. But just learning those histories is one of the first steps to it.
Yeah, I love that. Because I mean, it's not like people don't care. Like I didn't even think about looking up whose native lands I'm now living on until you wanted to do the land acknowledgement. And then I looked it up and I saw that it's the Yokuts live on our land, or they still do. And I didn't even know that like there was this lake that had been completely just cut off, that was their vital like resource for living. And I was just like, what? And like learning about how like terrible the like in California in the 1850s, the governor made like put bounties on Native Americans' heads, and like and so people were just hunting them down, and it's just like that. It's horrible. And like that's, as you say, I mean, just like we don't learn about these things in school. And so yeah, I think you're right. You created a ripple with me, and hopefully with our listeners today, Christine.
Yeah. Well, and then another big one that's come up lately is you've probably seen the news from Canada about the children's bodies being found at those boarding schools in Canada. And you have to remember that Canada was not the only one that had boarding schools. We also had boarding schools, and it was mandatory that children go. They were removed from their families, and tried to, it was actually like, by the US government, they were intentionally trying to separate children from their culture and forcibly assimilate them into Western culture. And a lot of those children died and never made it home for various reasons. And a lot of times the family never knew what happened to their kids. So there's a big push now that's really growing for US to also start looking into boarding schools and trying to get those children home finally.
Wow. It's just so much, and it can be really disheartening, but I think you're right. Just trying to educate ourselves is the first step, what we can do. So yeah, thanks for coming on, Christine. This was a really, really great conversation, and I think it definitely changed the way I think about some things, and I hope it was impactful to others as well. And would love to have you on another time, and maybe we can dive in a little deeper on this. But thanks so much, Christine.